When it came to loyalty, Wilson was unmatched. Choosing to make a full about-face and becoming the perfect servant. Prompt and on time for everything. His convenience was unmatched. Like a professional servant, Wilson stood in the doorway to inform his master that dinner would be available shortly. Yulion wasn't down for such a change. Daven was sure it was him who wanted the servant to acknowledge him as master. But for Yulion, this wasn't it at all. When he chose to toss away their miracle stone, he was expecting more than a clingy servant. The knock at the door caught both their attention. Even if Wilson was fast, there was no way he was that fast. Daven invited their guests in. To their surprise, a familiar face emerged, greeting Daven as Priest Dullen, worshipper of Gaia. The Reverend was there to express gratitude for Daven's previous actions. Yulion was amazed. A priest paying a visit to the likes of them could only lead to good things. But no way had he been expecting the priest to offer them a miracle stone. The stone had been rewarded for his actions when it came to healing the young master Revan. Daven couldn't simply accept such a gift. The very reason he had become a priest was put into question at the assembly. When Daven inquired if a miracle stone could help him heal the young master's arm, he hesitated, putting the value of the stone up against a human's life. On that day, the actions of a child bested him as Daven unselfishly chose to give up the precious miracle stone for the well-being of an enemy. He thanked Vincian, for his actions had allowed the priest to reflect upon himself. Daven took no credit for the enlightenment of the Reverend. But out of respect, he accepted the gift. The priest was relieved as he reached into his robes to retrieve something a bit more precious. He presented Vincian with a token of his gratitude. If he ever required the help of the temple, he was to present them with this token. And so that the young master Vincian understood the importance of such a gift, he relinquished knowledge that wasn't in the public domain. He had recently become a second-class priest. This didn't mean much to Daven, but Yulion was astonished by the revelation. Having such a token would net them the treatment akin to a second-class priest. The priest bowed to Daven, wishing him farewell and again thanking him for all he's done. Yulion's gamble had paid off. They had gained something much more valuable than an obedient servant. Daven gave praise where it was due, putting Yulion on cloud 9. He wondered if Yulion's tendency to be easily pleased came from his extended solitary life. The word praise sent Yulion into a panic. His father usually took his meal alone, but there was once a time where the victor of the Assembly of True Swords was invited to dinner. This piqued Daven's interest. It turned out to be the second-born, Sister Dia. Her overwhelming victory in the assembly necessitated such a reward. If what Yulion said was true, there was a possibility that this could happen to them. Rest was off the menu. This wasn't the opportunity he could pass up. Yulion couldn't believe his eyes. He was sure he had stressed there was only a 50-50 chance of this. In Daven's opinion, even if the chance was 1 in 100, it was totally worth it. Yulion felt this was bordering on embarrassment. Only for Wilson to rush in looking for the young master. As he stumbled over the word patriarch, Daven, fully dressed and awaiting such an announcement, took the words out of Wilson's mouth. The servant couldn't believe he was also capable of predicting such a thing. His master was simply on another level. Clear skies and starlight shined down on the Adenka estate. Daven silently walked the halls, head held high, his destination a supposed honor meeting with his father. It was indeed a surprise when his mother greeted him. His feat at the assembly was making its rounds. His biological mother had passed, giving birth to him. The woman before him was none other than his stepmother Versa Hylame. Before retirement, she was such a destructive force that she was simply known as the Giant. As the woman of the house, she was currently in charge of everything pertaining to the Adenka household. The meeting was brief as his father was waiting. Versa wasted no time escorting him into the study. With the doors firmly shut behind him. It was now do or die. His name echoed through the room as his reality began to warp. The pressure bearing down on him was restricting his ability to breathe. He quickly came to the understanding that this was a test. His father was showing him the true form of the patriarch. He spoke up, assuring his father there was no need for him to exert pressure upon his son in private. he was going to have to do better than that. The reason why would need to be explained. It was pretty simple. Upon entering the room, his mother referred to him as father, instead of by the title patriarch. Versa was thrown off and a bit upset that she had given up the ruse. He released his assault, praising his son's sense of awareness. The reason for his summons was twofold. First, to congratulate him on his victory at the assembly. And second, to address the validity of the concerns of Charles Adenka. The accusations of that man jumped to the forefront of his mind. How could an injury that eluded even the healing of a third-grade priest be something that was learned through proper means? An ominous present, very different from his father's pressure, encompassed his being. The glare of his mother cut clear through his soul, causing sweat to bead down his face. As suddenly as it started, it was over. There was zero chance of him being an apostle. Uncertainly coursed through his body, his mother had a trait that would allow her to see nothing but the truth. His parents pondered the conundrum. If it wasn't an apostle, then what type of martial arts did he possess? How had their son managed to cut off the arm of a two-star martial artist when he had yet to link an image to his heart? His technique was similar to what was recorded of the hero king. Daven couldn't believe he had never correlated his style with that of Kajin Samion. The way he wielded his blade was always unique, and it was said he was able to consume the abilities of his opponents. But it was also said his sword had managed to subdue the archdemon Daven. So, in his opinion, the stories were merely fabrications of the truth. He wondered what the Samion family could have been attempting to achieve by pushing such a narrative. His mother stepped in, intent on revealing the truth. How had Vincent managed to learn a martial art that resembled the hero Samion? His mother's gaze left Daven in a dangerous position. A single slip of the tongue would forfeit his life. He originally thought his father was interested in his talent, but it turned out to be his mother who was leading the investigation into the origin of his martial arts. Yulion appeared in time, ordering Daven to hold his tongue. This was a trap. With his lack of knowledge on this era, there was a high chance that any of Daven's answers would tip her suspicion. He had to make sure at all costs he didn't reveal his true identity. As things were, it was best if Yulion stepped up to the plate. With her treacherous eyes shining in his direction, she demanded he explain himself. Too bad Yulion's fear was paralyzing. All his life, his mother's eyes were the biggest opposition to his good-for-nothing son act. Daven understood, but insisted a single step was all that was needed. Every day of his life as the one-armed Daven, he was only able to accomplish his goals by pushing a single step forward. Once done, the rest would naturally follow. He understood Yulion's fear, and because of this, he decided to take the first step for him, announcing that he had received the revelation. This was exactly what Yulion feared. Such an uneducated answer was all that was needed to fuel his mother's fire. It was known that in most situations, to receive a revelation without a blessing was the work of evil. How could he have fallen into such a simple trap? And why hadn't Yulion, the minor god, warned him that the world perceived revelations without blessings as the work of malice? Versa pushed forward, seizing the opportunity. Daven's hesitation was being received as suspicion. There was no hand-holding going on here. If he didn't manage to ease her worries, she would force him through the trials of the sacred court. Or better yet, he could skip the bureaucracy and stand accused in front of the judges of Jeremil. This was enough to force Yulion into action, instructing Daven to follow his lead. He upped the ante, insisting that if she found him suspicious, he had no problem standing before the priests of the temple. She never expected he would be willing to take it that far. After all, if he was evil, would a priest of the third class relinquish a miracle stone upon him? Versa Hylame had personally given that particular miracle stone to the priest Dulin herself, and the Reverend felt it was an adequate gift for Daven's service to the temple. Her eyes confirmed his words to be nothing but truth. She pushed Daven further, inquiring if he truly had learned swordsmanship through a revelation. He admitted to learning many things from revelations, but swordsmanship wasn't one. The capability of reading mysterious sword movements was something he had since birth. He only recently decided to push forward with implementing such styles, a part of him was always hesitant to do so. This was Daven's truth. Yulion, on the other hand, augmented the story with Vincent's reality. After living a life of hesitation and never putting his best foot forward, he decided it was time for change. Even if it meant a few suspicious individuals would think less of him. Their two existences would blend together to form a truth that their mother's eye couldn't stand against. Together, the two announced their ultimate goal of showing the world their worth, and only then could they surpass the Samion family and fulfill the long-term goals of the Adenka legacy. His show at the assembly was to show his relatives and his father the strides he's made towards that goal. He believed, if his father saw his battle prowess in person, he would be able to make the appropriate judgment call. So far, the temple has approved. All that's left was the decision of the patriarch. His father was deep in thought. His choice, one way or the other, would decide Vincent's fate. Versa knew which way her husband was leaning, simply by him rubbing his chin. Not that she clued him in on this, but the gesture meant he was extremely satisfied. After thinking over all ramifications, his decision was made. He instructed Vincent to continue to train in his form of martial arts. Daven and Yulion's joy was zapped a moment later by their mother. While this might not be common knowledge, the swordsmanship of the hero King Kajin was extremely similar to that of the archdemon Daven. His father agreed to the truth of this fact. So Versa pushed on. For their son to use the hero king's swordsmanship would only draw the ire of the Samion family. But the fact that it also belongs to the archdemon could be their saving grace. She was sure her husband had taken this into account when he made his decision. The patriarch made sure his lady understood he had taken into consideration what needed to be considered. Hearing such words was a relief to her. With the patriarch's approval came the shifting of responsibility. Because of this, Daven would have to improve to avoid burdening his father. Even though his mother's warning seemed simple, it was anything but. In a single stroke, she not only affirmed his father's decisions but also laced it with her approval. Daven bowed, promising to keep it at the forefront of his thoughts. His victory at the Assembly of True Swords not only showed his worth, but set the standard for the direct descendants of the Adenka family. For raising up the family's name, his father decided to grant him something of his desire. His answer, to become stronger, was a good one, but it wasn't what he wanted, it was what he had to do. His father needed to know what he could do for him. Yulion seized the opportunity, announcing their need for access to the library. With no better thought in mind, Daven asked to be permitted entry to the family's archives. This was a giant request, as the rules stated only 3-star martial artists could be permitted such access. As of yet, his father was sure his son hadn't managed to link imagery to his heart. He agreed he hadn't managed such a feat, but what better chance did he have to behave like a spoiled brat of the Adenka household? The answer suited his father. For this, he permitted access to the lowest-ranked library that only 3-star martial artists could enter. He turned to his wife, announcing his intention to bestow the Crimson Lotus upon his son, Vincent. His father had no problems rewarding hard work, but most of all, what was important was that he kept his promise. The Crimson Lotus was a blade used by the patriarch in his youth. The weapon remained by his side as he made a name for himself. The blade was essentially the history of the Adenka family. It was simply amazing to be so old, and to still retain its edge. Yulion was simply out of his mind with happiness. But in Daven's opinion, it was too early to be so overjoyed. This was merely the start. The two of them would accomplish so much more. Yulion was initially disappointed that Daven had slid into his body, forcing him to relinquish any chance of the Spirit King being his ally. But now he doubted a Spirit King would have ever accomplished anything near what Daven could. He might be old-fashioned and extremely reckless, but Yulion knew his body was in no better hands. Wilson waited outside of the patriarch's mansion. Now that the formalities were over, it was time to head home. But his mother rushed out, intent on having a final word with her son. She was simply proud of what he had accomplished. The amount of effort he'd put into bettering himself couldn't have been an easy task. She was sure now that he had conquered the Assembly of True Swords. His plans to enter the Crimson Fortress were already in the works. But with the Crimson Demon in his way, there was no way he wouldn't need aid. The fortress was the #1 training institute of the Adenka family. In order to be acknowledged as a full-fledged martial artist, you would have to overcome the rigorous training of the institute. There were 2 requirements to enter, and he had already accomplished the first. With his victory of the Assembly of True Swords, all that was left was the subjunction of a low-ranked Crimson Demon. When it came to their mother, their best path forward was to simply be truthful. He acknowledged his shortcomings of not planning so far ahead. To Versa, the revelation was unexpected. To her observation, while he might have only used the mysterious technique a few times, his body was left in a state of unbelievable pain because of it. Daven had no problem agreeing with such an observation. His mother insisted he needed to listen closely. It's not possible to take down the Crimson Demon in a single attack. If he attempted it in his current state, his death would be assured. Julion's fear of his mother only left room for negative thoughts. While Daven believed their stepmother was taking a liking to them, Julian was skeptical of her advice. Having lived a life full of sorrow and pain, Daven knew treacherous individuals when he met them. With their mother's ties to the patriarch and eyes that can see truth, she could have easily set them up. While it was up in the air whether she liked them or not, it was obvious that she had no hostility towards them. Before hearing Versa out, Daven took the opportunity to thank her for all she's done and bid her farewell. Versa was attempting to impart valuable information to Vincian on the Crimson Demon, but the child was simply amazing, a martial artist lacking fear or hesitation. His boldness left her heart beating in her chest. A smile filled her face as she hoped Sarvana was looking down on her amazing son. Today he took his first step on his journey to become a martial artist. Wilson was setting out the laundry, happily supporting his master to the best of his ability. A suitcase slammed into the back of his head, and he was accused of plotting. He controlled himself, knowing he had turned over a new leaf. The maid Sari had returned. She had no intent of putting up with Wilson's shenanigans. She was so used to his bull that she attacked him when he was obviously doing the laundry. Sari glanced around the patio, noticing for the first time that he was actually working. It was only understandable since the young master had changed. Wilson, the direct servant, had too. Her mouth dropped open, wondering what had changed about her young master. Wilson assured her she was late to this revelation, and at the moment the young master was in the library reserved for the martial artists of the family. Julian and Daven were ripping through books at an impressive speed. No matter how hard they searched, they couldn't find what they were looking for. The revelation that there were no records from 500 years ago infuriated Daven. Someone had purposely cleansed the archive. All they could find were mere folk tales about the archdemon and the hero king. While Julian had expected there to be little information, he never expected to uncover a conspiracy. Everything from 500 years ago, including any records related to the heavenly exoskeleton and the source of absolute sword slash, had been erased or altered. At the moment, uncovering the lies about the archdemon Daven wasn't his top priority. Increasing his skills to allow him to defeat the Crimson Demon was where he needed to focus his attention. His limitations with imagery meant he needed a training routine that fit his capabilities. It took Julian a while to come to the understanding that Daven's tendency to refer to his ancestor Arslan as a child, and his insistence that he was framed by the hero king, along with the use of said swordsmanship, was completely suspect. He needed to know exactly who his brother was. Daven didn't know if Julian was capable of handling the truth. Passing on a lie would be highly disrespectful to the spirit, the very person responsible for their shared fate. If they were going to be a team, he had no choice in the matter. Daven tried to lay it on as soft as possible. But Julian was already starting to radiate with excitement. He announced he was the one and only Daven. Before Julian could process the words, sound waves shot through his brain. He had missed the important information and needed it to be repeated. The second attempt was worse than the first. The blaring noise caused him extreme pain. Daven immediately reacted, fearful for the safety of his companion. He relaxed, announcing he was fine, learning who Daven wasn't as important as he thought after all. The commotion had placed Daven in the path of a book that was completely suspect. First Love with a Watermill couldn't actually belong among the books for mana training. The archives were managed by the family. The chances of a romance novel being misplaced had to be low. As the book was opened, the truth was revealed. Someone had kept a secret record of history, albeit in a slightly different form. The contents of the book was way too much for the two young men, causing them extreme discomfort. Yulion, fanning himself, couldn't believe the truth had been kept in this form. But the approach was perfectly suited to throw off an unsuspecting enemy. Daven's excitement caught Julion's attention. The romance novel's main character had no imagery, but possessed the power of love as a trait. The book was much more than it seemed. The explanation it alluded to was that traits were not used to induce the flow of mana, but that the flow of mana was used to bring about its manifestation. The user needs to throw out all previous knowledge of the theory of imagery. The freedom of mana alone can make all things possible. Yulion was horrified such a technique would lead to the death of countless martial artists. But contrary to Julion's belief, Daven had just found the person who managed to survive. With the knowledge in the romance novel, they too would be able to manifest traits by way of a mana flow. Even with imagery, learning a trait was dangerous. Traits were akin to the wealth of a martial artist, so there was no one who would easily part with the knowledge. Even so, Daven believed they'd found a path to strength. There was nothing left to do but to immediately begin the testing. Julion's fears wouldn't hold them back. Upon their exit, they were greeted by an adoring fangirl. Sari needed to hear the truth from the horse's mouth. Had her Vincian truly defeated Revan, and because of said victory, had been rewarded by his father with the Crimson Lotus? Daven turned to Yulion, who explained that this was his maid Sari, who had to take a leave of absence because of a family emergency. The memories began to flow in. All this time, he thought Vincian had been alone, but there was at least one person who was completely infatuated with the good-for-nothing coward of the Adenka family. As soon as she heard the truth from his mouth, she dropped to her knees, overjoyed as tears flowed out of her face. She was sure his life was headed toward a downward spiral where he would be bullied even more after his loss at the assembly. Daven looked to Yulion for knowledge on how to console this woman. But the spirit was continuing his trend of being useless in such situations, leaving honesty as the only path forward. He dropped to his knees, apologizing for withholding such a secret from her. Going forward, he would do his best to make her proud to be his servant. The most unexpected individual broke up their bonding moment. None of them was pleased by the sight of young Master Revan, but the blonde was intent on talking to Vincian. Sari took on the role of mediator for the two Adenkas. Having the enemies in the same room was leaving her with anxiety. The awkward silence was heavy in the room as the two merely stared at each other. Daven had no problem waiting for his cousin to make his move. As Sari proposed sandwiches, Revan initiated his intentions. This wasn't exactly what Daven expected, but if it had to be this way, he was down. Revan had every intention of settling his debt from the Assembly of True Swords. Daven reached for his Crimson Lotus, prepared to defend against the ambush. Now that the secret was out of the bag, absolute sword slash was essentially useless. His attempt to secure his charge didn't go over well. Sari simply refused to leave his side. As she announced how much she owed her young master, Revan stood behind his sword, acknowledging that Daven had forgiven his rudeness and relinquished his miracle stone for the sake of an enemy, while he himself acted like a coward to regain his arm at the expense of his father. But in the end, he received everything he ever wanted. Besides retaining his arm, the father he remembered from his childhood was returned to him. He regained everything, but as of yet, he had given nothing in return. On the day of the assembly, he was nothing more than a coward, which wasn't the life he wished to live. Lowering his head and placing his knee upon the ground, he laid his sword out, with the hilt towards Daven. While he didn't believe it was enough, Revan swore his loyalty. Everyone in the room was astonished to see Revan kneeling. Yulion cautioned him not to fall for the tricks of Revan Adenka. But Daven was pleasantly surprised that he had been wrong. The collateral descendant wasn't a hopeless case after all. The placement of his sword meant that Revan was willing to give his life for Daven. Yulion couldn't take all this martial arts stuff. Yulion realized this was exactly what they needed, while he didn't trust the Adenka. He knew there was an immediate benefit to having him around. Daven took Yulion's silence as an agreement to proceed. He placed the crimson lotus upon Revan's shoulder and accepted the oath laid before him. Daven announced his intent to remain by his cousin's side until the moment he was betrayed. While he originally had his doubts that the sword at Daven's waist was crimson lotus, up close, he knew it was indeed the original, meaning his cousin had gained the trust of the patriarch. Because of this, there was no way he would regret swearing his loyalty. Sari had been skeptical that her master had turned over a new leaf, but she couldn't deny the sights before her eyes. The times of the good-for-nothing cowardly Vincian was something she could safely leave in the past. Yulion felt bad for this, but their time was limited. He only hoped Revan's newfound loyalty could withstand the assault. Once he got Daven up to speed, he was ready to proceed with gaining the traits of the Dwarf King's blessing from Revan. Versa and the Patriarch discussed the future of their son. She brought up Vincian's intent to enroll in the Crimson Fortress in the coming year. He gave her his full attention, for the Crimson Demon wasn't something that was easily defeated. She had attempted to give him information specifically on that subject. But their son, being their son, seemed extremely confident and didn't push for the information. It turns out that the demon is only capable of being destroyed by the mana of a 3-star martial artist. The exact reason the Crimson Demon is a rite of passage is for this trait, and this trait alone. But more importantly, she brought up the fact that Revan Adenka has been a guest at Vincian's guesthouse for the past few days. It turned out obtaining the trait of the Dwarf King's blessing was as difficult as Daven expected. Revan knew the trait in and out and had the instructions down to a T. Yulion was on the edge. All it took was a simple mistake, and he would lose all he had worked for. The method used was a mix of old and new. Revan pored over the romance novel's instructions, deciphering what he could as he went. Understanding that this was the only way for his cousin to attain the traits of the Dwarf King's blessing, seeing as how he's not able to link imagery to his heart. After reading through the book, he agreed to help if Daven believed the book wasn't bullshit. He would guide the flow while Daven meditated. This essentially meant Daven's life was in his hands. Daven agreed. His cousin swore his loyalty. The word of a martial artist was their bond. Revan knew if the situation was reversed, there was no way he could put his life in Vincian's hands. He was still being outdone by the main line of Adenka. But it wasn't all bad. After all, it was the first time losing felt so good. If it wasn't for Daven's book, he would have never believed in 500 years that there was an individual in the main lineage who was using mana without imagery. Daven was beginning to slip, but Yulion was there to lecture him about staying on task. He was starting to get frustrated at the spirit. After all, this was all his idea. You could bet your britches Yulion was going to be on that ass. Daven was doing whatever he pleased. His actions were the equivalent of doing somersaults by the side of a cliff. Luckily, Revan was there to encourage Daven to calm down. There was no need to rush. He would get it eventually. Not taking everything you gained by force had never been how he progressed. As one-armed Daven, risking his life was a daily occurrence. There comes a time when you have to throw caution to the wind and push forward. His mana was completely out of control and Yulion could see nothing in front of them but their end. He was so close. All he had to do was connect the flow and everything would be complete. As the two pieces were forced together, Revan rushed to Vincian. To complete the flow early would only lead to catastrophic effects. The two ends merged together, and Daven was triumphant. But only for a moment, as the two parts ripped apart, and shock waves of mana exploded outwards. Revan was sent flying, crashing into a daybed as pain radiated throughout his entire body. Next year's enrollment was too far away. There was still half a year for him to enroll in the Crimson Fortress. And his father wanted him to make it in time for that deadline. After all, his son had already taken out a 2-star martial artist. The Crimson Demon should pose him no problem. Revan rushed to his cousin's side, only for him to shoot up insisting he was fine. Learning the trait took Revan nearly half a year. Daven was pushing too far too fast. Even though he was insanely talented, the process was going to take at least 2 months. His father needed him, ready to defeat the Crimson Demon within a month's time frame. Yulion was all over Daven. He warned him this would happen. His life had truly flashed before his eyes. It was so bad he believed he was reincarnating all over again. Versa had handed off the dirty work to the Grand Chamberlain. The direct message from the Patriarch needed to be relayed to the young Master Vincent. His rite of passage needed to be completed within 1 month's time. The Chamberlain was rooting for his success, but how much could he accomplish in such a short time? She burst into his room without announcing herself, only to be surprised by the sight inside. The room was a disaster zone. Besides the hole in the wall, and its half-destroyed interior, the occupants were receiving first aid. The fury of the house's #1 servant radiated outwards. She needed the young master to explain exactly what was going on. Revan knew they were in trouble. The Grand Chamberlain Raelsa was a fearsome 7-star martial artist. Daven initially felt the need to lie to the Grand Chamberlain, but Sari wasn't having it. She went in hard. While not knowing much about mana, she knew that this wasn't an occurrence that happened because of meditation. She had no idea why her young master was continuing to make her worry. Over the last few days of observing him, she truly didn't believe he was the same person he once was. Seeing as how she was given a direct answer from a master of the household, the Grand Chamberlain couldn't push forward. All she could say was that whatever meditation he was doing, he needed to do it fast. She delivered the message that he had to defeat the Crimson Demon and complete his rite of passage within a month. Both he and Revan were thrown by her announcement. The fact that his father was setting a time limit on completing the rite of passage could only mean he had expectations. Instead of being saddened by such news, a smile spread across his face. 1 month from this day, she would personally accompany him on his expedition as his guardian. She worried for the young master. If he had any chance of completing this task, he would need to give it all he had over the next 30 days. Revan knew it would take Vincent at least 2 months to conquer the Dwarf King's blessing. Could it really be done in the span of a month? He had no choice but to push forward. Every moment would be a crucial opportunity that he couldn't waste. Sari could tell by the look in his eyes that he was planning to be reckless. She knew there was no way to control him, but asked him anyway to refrain from overdoing it. The way he promised without hesitation upset her just a little, causing her mana to leak out. He couldn't believe it. Was Sari truly just a simple maid? The overwhelming amount of mana that extruded from her was astonishing. He knew better than to argue with her, so he looked into her eyes and made the promise. But once it was done, he asked her to leave. He and Revan had to discuss business. She slammed the door on her way out. Revan knew what he was going to ask, but 1 month simply wasn't enough. He would have to find another way. Daven began to work the mana through its complicated patterns. Once the flow was complete, he looked up to Revan, asking him if the mana circuit was correct. The look on their faces was priceless. Between the two, they managed to complete a full sentence. He had indeed completed the flow. The process of failing was all he needed to get the gist of the complicated circuit. Yulion had full faith in his brother the entire time. He had no intention of waiting a month. He planned to fully blow his father's expectations out of the water. 2 weeks of training and he was ready to proceed to the next step. The three gathered in an isolated forest. It was finally time for Daven to attempt to manifest his trait. His companions were ready, either intended to miss a second of this. But before Daven started, he insisted Revan take a step back just in case there was a failure. Like that was going to happen. He had every intention of seeing his cousin succeed. The two couldn't believe they had found someone completely capable and loyal. With that, Daven began the process as he continued to concentrate, the circuit completed, radiating with an immense amount of mana. Before progressing to an even more complicated diagram, Yulion sensed a presence unlike any other. He turned around as a shadow encompassed the clearing. The dwarf king, in celestial form, towered above them all. His eyes glowed as Yulion realized only he as a god could see the celestial being. All his fury was forced into his hammer, as he cast down his blessing directly upon the three. The golden energy forced its way into Daven, causing him to radiate its celestial light. When he opened his eyes, what appeared before him was the fruit of his labor, the blessing of the dwarf king. This was the first defensive trait, body strengthening. It was essentially the step right before Steelman. Revan radiated with happiness. He couldn't believe he had accomplished the impossible. Daven had managed to obtain the dwarf king's blessing in under a month. As the celestial being faded from existence, Yulion wished him farewell. With the power now in him, he could overcome the burden of absolute sword slash. He now had the foundation he needed to take out the Crimson Demon. He wasted no time giving all praise to the individual who made this possible. But Revan insisted he saved it for after he defeated the Crimson Demon. Sadly, there was another favor Daven needed to ask of him. 2 days later, the expedition began. It was finally time for them to head to the lair of the Crimson Demon. The Grand Chamberlain wasn't entirely pleased with the way things were going. Daven fully intended to blow his father's expectations out of the water. She really hoped he knew what he was doing. Wasting the 2 weeks that was given could possibly be his downfall. Seeing the look on her face, he inquired what was wrong. This would make the 4th time she protected those taking part in the rite of passage. The patriarch, his siblings, as well as all others who were direct descendants of the Adenka family. Of them all, no one has ever failed to pass the trial. Her loyalty to Sarvana meant that she had to ensure that her son wouldn't be the first to fail. She asked him to not take on such a challenge if all he had was baseless bravery. With a glint in his eye, he turned to the Grand Chamberlain and insisted he had this completely in the bag. The carriage thudded along, moving towards its final destination. For the most part, their conversation was kept to a minimum. But Daven wasn't entirely pleased with the chaperone disguised as a guardian. Yulion explained that her role was more as a supervisor than a protector. If there wasn't someone to keep an individual honest, there was a chance that the Crimson Demon's trophy could be bought at auction. Daven couldn't believe there were people willing to tarnish their names and abandon their responsibility to the progress of their martial arts. Yulion sighed. The old-timer was from a place that was much too innocent. The Grand Chamberlain broke the silence for the betterment of Vinchin, inquiring if he had done his research on the Crimson Demon. Both he and Yulion stared forward as if they had failed to study for a quiz at school. She pushed forward with no intention of allowing them to distract her. 3-star mana or higher was the prerequisite for subjugating the Crimson Demon. From her point of view, the young master had definitely not reached that milestone. Her words made Yulion realize that Daven hadn't shown any interest in doing research on the Crimson Demon. He wasn't worried in the least. Daven didn't believe in coincidences. Arslan had to have a hand in this rite of passage. Seeing as how the Crimson Demon was the very first monster he subjugated, studying wasn't something he needed to waste his time on. The Grand Chamberlain simply wished the young master would at least put up his guard. She knew her personality was unapproachable, but she wished he would at least make use of her. Daven cut straight to the heart of the problem. Why exactly was the Grand Chamberlain so eager to lend him a hand? And he simply wasn't buying her answer that she was the guardian and supervisor of this trial. So, he changed the subject in an attempt to square things up. Her budget embezzlement didn't come across as something that was very well hidden. She assured him he caught her lacking. But Daven wasn't buying it. From his point of view, the Grand Chamberlain had intentionally revealed her hand. His astute revelation silenced her as she stared blankly at him over the top of her glasses. He smugly assured her if it was something she didn't wish to talk about, he was fine with that. After all, she had been entirely courteous when it came to his training, not poking her nose in where it didn't belong. The horse's refusal to move another inch meant they had arrived at their destination. The two departed the carriage. The location was a complete surprise to Daven. You would think this place would be called the Lair of the Crimson Demon, but it had no exact name. Most people knew it as the Old Temple. it turned out, after taking down the creature known as the archdemon Daven. The temple was built to commemorate the part their ancestor Arslan played in said victory. Arslan's name reared its head once again, and this time directly tied to the Crimson Demon. As the days went on, the evidence that all of this was intentional continued to stack up. With no more ado, the Grand Chamberlain removed her sword, radiating an immense amount of mana, as she proceeded to commence the trial. She raised her arm to the sky and released her mana directly into the barrier above them. The structure was rejuvenated. The mana barrier was at a level that it would only allow a single monster to pass through. The eyes of an evil visage appeared from inside the temple. The demon wasted no time approaching the intruders. Daven, seeing no point in standing around, asked the Grand Chamberlain to watch closely, for she needed to report back exactly what she saw. In front of her eyes, he would again prove his worth to the Adenka family. The scythe wielder rushed in, intent on finishing his battle in a single blow. In Julion's opinion, he should dodge before finding the sword path that would lead to absolute sword slash. But that just wasn't the play. Increasing the distance between the two was simply advantageous to whoever wielded the largest weapon. Because of this, it was better for him to proceed with close-quarter combat. Daven rushed in, Crimson Lotus at the ready, as he brought the Crimson Demon's initial attack to a sudden halt. He announced to the demon that it wasn't allowed to be the aggressor in this situation, as he would be taking over that role moving forward. With him staying within the swinging distance of the Crimson Demon, it had no choice but to continuously retreat. Daven's tactics should be completely obvious to anyone observing this fight. The young master didn't come across as someone who was having their first real fight at the age of 14. The proficiency of his combat was something she doubted many martial artists would be capable of matching. He was coming across as someone who was entirely familiar with the tendencies of his enemy. The Dwarf King's blessing was simply miraculous. The effects it had on his untrained body would be the downfall of the Crimson Demon. It would allow him every opportunity imaginable to find the sword path for absolute sword slash to manifest. Daven was outclassing the demon at every turn. The way he walked over the demon was simply embarrassing. After degrading the creature, he felt it was time to give it a little space. The Crimson Demon was beyond agitated. There was no way it was used to being forced into the role of the hunted. Because of this, Daven was sure it would come at him with everything it had. And that attack would have an astronomical number of openings. In such a situation, it was simply impossible not to find the sword path. This would be Daven's first opportunity to enhance his ability with his traits. He initiated absolute sword slash augmented by body strengthening. He unleashed the void, and as the purple haze sliced down the creature, it was hard to tell who exactly was the monster. With a single attack, the Crimson Demon compressed into a pearl that dropped to the ground with an ominous thud. Daven immediately turned to the Grand Chamberlain to make sure she had witnessed it all. She stood there, radiating her surprise. There was no way the young master didn't know. The reason why the Crimson Demon couldn't be defeated with a single attack was because the demon had 2 lives. As Daven stood there, completely engrossed in his victory, he had no idea his end was only moments away. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure to support the original creators. Supporting their work will allow us to continue to get amazing chapters in the series. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.